crew for having me back for a second year. That's enough for me. We have 4 wonderful panelists, like I mentioned. Each panelist will speak for about 12 minutes. We'll hold all questions till the end. A word about questions, please make sure that they are questions with an inflection at the end of the tone. No questions that are maybe a little bit more like statements, nothing like that. We just want to make sure that our panelists have enough time to speak. Okay, great. So before we get started, I will introduce our first speaker. This is Jacob Kramer-Duffield, PhD. He is a data and audience consultant and a researcher. He's worked for nearly a decade in media analytics, pioneering podcast audio and audience measurement, and thinking about how systems in the space are evolving. His background is as a researcher in digital identities and understanding how increased usage of new communications technologies change how we conceive ourselves and relate to each other. He'll be chatting with us today about the growing political economy of podcasting.
I'll just let that be. Hi, and thanks for coming to this talk. What I hope to open today is a conversation about podcasting that isn't based mostly around jokes around food delivery services, mattress websites, or easy one-liners about the ubiquity of podcasts and the insufferability of their hosts. That is a different talk. What I hope to accomplish today is to start thinking about the history and structures of the medium, technologies, institutions, and people, and how they've gotten us to this moment. The kinds of voices that we hear, the kinds of work that is performed, and the parties who profit or are sustained by these acts are all the product of a very specific political economy, and it's worth examining with a critical eye. Podcasting is an unusual communicative medium in several ways. Like radio or television, it was in fact invented at a particular time and place. But unlike them, it was not a big technical breakthrough, but rather a simple technical change in an open web standard. A few lines of code, in other words. The RSS 0.92 standard was released in December of 2000. And unlike the previous RSS standards, it allowed for the inclusion of media files. That's it. That's podcasting. There's a very interesting and weird story to be told about the early days of podcasting, but again, that's a different talk. What's important for our purposes is as much about what the RSS standard doesn't include as what it does. On the host end of things, people serving the files and setting up the feed, there's very little information about the client that's transmitted. The most useful are the IP address and user agent for sort of identifying and maintaining identity at a moment, but not really over time, because IP address shift and people use different software over time. And the user agent describes the software being used to download the file, whether it's the Apple Podcast app, or Mozilla, or a Wi-Fi connected dishwasher, or whatever. But to the consternation of some in the podcast business, and certainly many in the advertising business, this is not remotely on the level of the personally identifiable information that we all give and have long been giving with every website we visit, every app we download. Because most podcast producers host their own files or outsource to a few services like Libsyn, we do not otherwise have user profiles of their listeners. There's far more about users that they don't know, that we don't know, than that we do. Important caveat about Apple. Due to the early embrace of podcasting by the iTunes Music Store and the adoption of the iPod, Apple gained the initial dominance of the podcast listenership. And it's still a majority, though that's decreasing every year. And while Apple doesn't know your podcast listening habits through RSS, they do know through the podcast app and iTunes tied to your larger Apple profile the information you give them as a matter of commerce and for sustaining that Apple universe profile. But for the most part, they're not telling us, either the public or podcast producers, what they know. They started sharing anonymized analytics on this behavior on their platform at the end of last year, but do not at present specifically monetize podcasts themselves for now. And that most assuredly is enough to talk. So given that podcasting was at the same time as the web got creepier and creepier and web video kept trying to happen, and eventually did, a medium that was not vulnerable to automated monetization, who would choose to invest resources? Answer is threefold. First, some early startup money that tried to figure out the space in the early 2000s. Long story short, they really didn't, and there's some interesting cultural artifacts that are of a product of those efforts, but for the most part, it did not have a huge impact on what podcasting is as we know it today. Hobbyists and those with passion projects, and that does have a lot to say about parts of what the podcasting ecosystem have become. But then, of course, public media. And that's what I'm going to focus most of my attention on, just because that accounted for the largest influx of listeners and the most early investment in the medium. For public media radio stations, and for public media generally, the value proposition was clear. While their audience was previously limited to the people within range of the radio transmitter while a particular program was being broadcast, and public media tends not to have exceptionally powerful radio transmitters, it was now possible for anyone, at any time, anywhere, to listen to their shows. And since the shows were already paid for by a combination of member support, underwriting, which is the weird pseudo ads on public media that they're limited in what kinds of claims and statements they can make, that's a whole thing, and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and while bandwidth wasn't free early, each new listener was more a marginal benefit to a mission-driven organization. They got people listening, and of course, those new listeners were also potential new members or contributors. The origin story of podcasting is thus one that highly privileged the worldview and tastes of a demographic you're liable to hear mostly described in Republican attack ads of the 1990s. Upper middle class, Volvo driving, Apple computer owning, NPR listening, overeducated white coastal liberals. I didn't have a 240, I had a 760 in high school. This does, however, turn out to matter quite a bit. In the early pre-serial days, indeed this explains the whole reason why serial existed, the biggest hit podcasts were, with a few exceptions, the biggest shows on public radio. Because of the discussed ambiguous analytics, monetization lagged behind. But when it arrived, it was not insubstantial. Even given the limitations of underwriting and the CPMs you can drive from that, rather than advertising, shows like This American Life, with broadcast audiences in the millions, and digital audiences also in the lower millions, were able to substantially alter their fortunes. And thus was This American Life able to spin itself off from its original member station into an independent organization and finance the development of Serial, and further define the very question of what a podcast can sound like. What a podcast sounds like, and also what a podcast looks like. For a large share of earlier listeners, what a podcast sounded like was Ira Glass, or Jad Abumrad, or Robert Krulwich, or Terry Gross, or Stephen Dubner. What it sounded like was very much what the audience looked like. Well-educated, upper middle class, mostly white, mostly men. But these were not the only people who make podcasts. While it has done a poor job of hiring and promoting people of color within its ranks, public media, more than many other media, has long had a more representative share of women on staff, mostly not behind the mic. Women have excelled as producers and administrators for years, but with the exception of Terry Gross, very few had become hosts until very recently. This led to two main trends: bias, unconscious and not, over how and to whom podcasts are marketed, and grave imbalances in the distribution of compensation and workload. To cut right to the chase, women in public media and podcasting more broadly have long carried a disproportionate share of making male hosts sound good, and have, for their troubles, been dramatically underpaid relative even to their male colleagues with the same titles, excluded from the host chair, and, of course, sexually harassed for their efforts. And while these are the most prominent examples of the men in public media and podcast space thus far called to some account for their actions, it's a small share of the senior men in the space who have long treated women, producers, who make their shows as something like a constantly refreshed pool of available dates and or exploitable labor. Suffice to say, the arrival of venture funding to back new podcasting startups and to subsidize the medium through venture-funded startups has not diminished this gender or power imbalance. But the arrival of larger economic movers has also created other spaces. Traditionally excluded voices, writers and hosts with non-public media backgrounds, new formats and approaches to storytelling, and alternate methods of financing, whether it be crowdfunding, creator-owned networks, public benefit corporations, has risen just as the now archetypal voices in podcasting have prospered. These point to alternate models of how this medium can work, with high audience engagement among them, leading to a viability threshold, so the sort of size of audience that's necessary to sustain an endeavor, that's substantially below other broadcast media. There's also another pressure, the gradual move to streaming. With each year, broadband signals improve and more listeners are hearing podcasts, not in the old download and listen later model, which was established with the initial use of iPods and other MP3 players as the default method, and then they're not really being effective wireless for a lot of people, but through streaming, which technical protocol allows for tracking just as thorough and creepy as anything else on the web or in apps. And as more money floods in along with new users never habituated to life within iPod, the pressure will only increase at the cost of user privacy. And so I'd like to propose an approach for thinking about the political economy of podcasting. There are four major factors to consider. First, audience. We need to consider who the audio was made for in addition to who is listening to it. Second, production and representation. What is the process by which the audio was made? And who is being represented? I mean representation here in several senses. Most obviously, whose voices are literally being heard as the hosts, reporters, and producers. But also, whose views and perspectives are being represented in the overall editorial output and mission, the kinds of stories that are getting told. And finally, who is being represented as having done the work? Are there hosts on a pedestal with producers and engineers listed in the credits, or is the effort framed as a collaboration? Third, there's the issue of distribution and consumption. How is audio being sent out to listeners? What formats and contexts is it being consumed? This can include issues of exclusive windowing on various platforms, as both Apple and Spotify have done, total platform independence and agnosticism, unplatforming as in the case of some Patreon-funded shows. And while analytics can get at part of the consumption question, this point also contains the mysterious last mile question. Just how are podcasts listened to? We still know comparatively little. Finally, there's the question of monetization, which informs and interacts with all the above points. Ad-funded shows have to quantify and sell their audiences, which has the effect of reinforcing a search for the kinds of upper-middle-class audiences we've discussed. Venture-funded shows and studios have a pressure to follow not only on these valuable audiences, but also on massive scale, which dictates the kinds of stories they can, can't, will, or won't tell. Distribution medium can add the further veto point of much larger, better-financed platform companies into the equation, which again can constrain what stories are told. And of course, compensation, which follows both the status quo ante of imbalance between hosts and producers and gender imbalances, and which dictates the kinds of stories that shows can tell and what they can't. These questions are just the beginning, and I hope you'll come away from this talk with a more critical eye to this emerging medium and be motivated to incorporate it as a distinct and interesting part of the media spectrum in your own inquiries. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Jacob. Next we have Margot Hanley. She will be presenting Alexa, Please. I feel like I should say that, Alexa, please. I don't know, her talk is on emerging interaction rules between people and voice assistants. Margot is a qualitative researcher finishing up her master's degree in sociology at Columbia University. She's interested in the social dimensions of human-to-robot interactions, She'll be discussing with us her current research, focusing on voice assistants and the emergent interaction rules between them and humans. After graduating, she's heading over to Cornell Tech, where she will be studying the spillover effects of robot to human interactions. Last but not least, she moonlights as a procurement artist. That's pretty cool. This is Margot.
Thank you. Take this off. Cool. Hi, thank you for the introduction. My name is Margot Hanley. Like Joelle said, I'm a master's student at Columbia, finishing up this spring, but I'm going to be continuing this research through the summer. So you're catching me a little bit in the midst of a work in progress, as you can see by the title change as well. But yeah, today I'm going to be talking about this kind of emergent interaction that we're having, and I say emergent, voice interface has been around for a very long time, but I say emergent because of the scale at which they're kind of existing in our homes, in the public discourse, et cetera. I think more broadly, I'm really interested in the social implications of technology, of emerging technology, and this one particularly interesting to me because human-computer interface and human-robot interface, these disciplines, I think, do a really fine job of talking about interactions and interactions with technology, but sociology does not. And certainly there are some theorists in the field that are talking about it, but I think that it's really important that there's a social lens and a social perspective on these interactions that are just proliferating there. As you can see, as everyone knows, I think voice assistants are coming into all of our homes, our friends' homes. Probably everyone here, or potentially has interacted with one or has stories about interacting with them. 25 million sold in 2017. From 1.7 in 2015 when the Echo was kind of introduced. And so they're growing so rapidly. And with it, kind of we're hearing a frenzy of weird stories, of questions, kind of how do we, is that I have 5 left? Okay, cool, sorry. I was like, what? Kind of with it, these weird questions like, why do they all have feminine or female voices? Are my kids going to stop saying please and thank you? Am I going to stop saying please and thank you? What is the point of please and thank you? And like these weird, introspective, dark moments where you're kind of questioning phatic interactions, right? The kind of like small talk that we have to go on through the day, and kind of all the things we do in normal human interactions, and kind of how they're mapping onto these interactions with these devices. So super interesting space to me. So I went into the field using kind of a grounded theory approach, which means I had no particular research question in true qualitative researcher, sociologist fashion. I went in not deductively in the slightest, kind of just interested in kind of what themes and patterns are emerging. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the methods and kind of the data, just because I think that's important, and then tell you some kind of some of the findings that I'm seeing. Not as well organized, I don't think, but super interesting, and like I said, a work in progress. So so I went into the field kind of in the wild in device owners' homes. So doing ethnographic interviews, kind of sitting with owners of these devices and talking to them about their experience with the devices, as well as interacting with the device. Of course, the device would just kind of barge in, like for instance, like an Alexa would just kind of like hear its name and then just kind of like jump in and say, I don't understand that, which obviously would like produce an amazing rich litany of follow-up questions for me as an interviewer. So very fun. I only was able to interview people with Echoes and Google Assistants. I didn't interview any with Cortanas because that was hard to find. And similarly, HomePod. So we'll see about that. And then, but yeah, 16 device owners, a few couples in there, and 4 of those were individuals in their mid-90s, so at a retirement home in Southern California, who are obviously self-selected, very tech-savvy individuals, but also own devices and had a lot to say. And then device producers, so on the flip side of this, in a face-to-face social interaction, one of these things is a voice assistant that is a combination of, is an assemblage really of values and ethics and perspectives and backgrounds of thousands and thousands of people, including, engineers are what most people think about, but it's script writers who are writing the answer to what Alexa or Siri says when you say I'm sad, and they have to make these decisions. Script writers, evangelists who are going around training new engineers to think about voice user interfaces, this whole weird world on the back end of these devices. So went out to the West Coast, interviewed 11 of those people to get this kind of high-level perspective of what's going on, not only with the interactions themselves, but what's informing, I won't say mind, but this social actor, what is informing what's coming out of its speaker. Theoretically, grounded theory is great. Kind of gives you a lot of flexibility, but similarly want to go in the field with some kind of sociological, theoretical guardrails. Symbolic interactionism is really interesting branch of microsociology, which mainly focuses on how to understand society at the really small scale. So how do we understand our institutions, our norms, how they're being produced and reproduced in face-to-face interactions, in small group interactions, paired very nicely with the research that I want to do here. Founded really more by social psychologists, and then formalized by Bloomer, and Irving Goffman is someone people might know who did kind of fun dramaturgical interpretations of interactions as performances, putting on our masks and things. So really interesting, rich field. 3 main tenets here, kind of all around meaning and how meaning is brought to interactions, how it's created through interactions, and how it changes through interactions. So obviously, in this case, I was kind of going into the field thinking, this is, a voice assistant, and Alexa is familiar to us through its voice interface, through it speaks language. It's a language is, a collection of symbols with which we talk to other humans with, but it's not human. And so kind of how are people assimilating this thing into their lives, into their homes, into their private spaces, and then, of course, how meanings are made through interactions, and then how that's changing. So that's the main theoretical perspective. At the great chagrin of my sociology department, I also included some work by Clifford Nass, who's not a sociologist, and of course disciplines hate that. And he did some really awesome stuff. Probably don't have much time to dig into it here, but positioning computers as social actors. So like I said, in sociology, that's still kind of it's still in flux. Bruno Latour does some really cool stuff talking about non-humans, and there's some others as well. But Clifford Nass, not necessarily a sociologist, just communication professor at Stanford, talked a lot about this, did some really amazing experiments proving that people will engage with the computer in a social way, will kind of mindlessly apply these like human heuristics when a computer has some social or human cue to it. So in this case, like a voice output will make people, kind of use gender stereotypes. Or in some cases, this photo is from an article, is like sweet talking your computer, where people wouldn't want to hurt their computer's feelings. And so they would go out of their way to to rate a computer poorly, like not in front of it or something, like these kind of experiments. So it's super amazing. And of course, this was in the 80s or something. And so now, with these voice assistants, it's just more and more sophisticated. They're responsive, they're talking to us, they're responding directly to things we say, et cetera. And so it's even more pronounced impacts like this. And I'm seeing it a lot in my data. And so this is Clementine, one of the women I was telling you about at this retirement home. She says, and it, oddly enough, that pleasant female voice that they've endowed Alexa with, it becomes familiar and friendly, and you kind of look forward to hear it. I always say good morning to her, and she tells me a rotten joke in return. Which was funny because I interviewed someone who writes these jokes, and they were like, rewrite these amazing jokes that everyone loves. And I was like, this is awkward. So a lot of interesting things here, right? Pleasant female voice is kind of fits into this narrative, this big, huge question, right, of like gender and why do these things have female voices and what is the impact of that? And, there are meaningful impacts of that interface, of it being a voice assistant, right? In a social hierarchy of it having a female voice and playing into these stereotypes, which I talk a little bit more about later. But, you kind of see it working really effectively. And the companies are aware of this. They're aware of female voices being very effective. They're aware of making these devices subservient being really effective. And that's how they're being designed. And it works. Cool. So it's clear that people are saying she, people are saying her, people are anthropomorphizing it, people are, companionship, like I just told you with that woman Clementine, is one way in which people are endeared to the device. There's other ones, some kind of weird, people will, one guy interviewed talked about kind of how he was trying to be make sexual jokes with it. It wasn't like being like sexual enough, and it was like putting him in a bad mood or something, right? So people are trying to get something out of these devices, often in curious ways. But anyways, I kind of wanted to see if the she and the her, the pronoun stuff, the basic high-level anthropomorphism went any deeper. So I used, so I'm kind of talking today a little bit about this kind of research methodological tool called breaching exercises. I don't know if anyone knows anything about this. It's like intentionally subverting a social norm to make everyone uncomfortable, to make someone uncomfortable, and then to learn something from that discomfort, right? And to learn kind of what the contour of that boundary is and why it is there. And so, kind of developed by Harold Garfinkel, ethnomethodologist, which is a sibling with symbolic interactionism. And obviously they're mortifying and super embarrassing. And I was doing them, and I sat down with like the nicest woman, self-identified Midwesterner, super polite. It's like the end of our interview. We had this like really nice like rapport, and I was like feeling all good. And then I go, "Do you mind if I?" And I kind of gesture towards the device, and she's like, "Sure." And I go, "Alexa, fuck you." And she blanches. She just like stares at me and she blanches. And I go, and it was so uncomfortable, right? Which meant it was a very successful breaching exercise. And I go, "Oh, like, why are you feeling so uncomfortable right now?" She goes, "I feel surprised. I was surprised you said that. It's so weird to say this. I think it just makes me think negative feelings about you. Like I wouldn't want to be friends with someone who's mean to the wait staff." And then more of these, right? So here's a guy I did the exact same thing with. And I kept in all the ums and nos and the things, but you guys should just read it. It's uncomfortable to read. Also, it stutters so much. But so what you kind of see like emerging, there's more and more and more of these, right? Is that people, and what this is a voice and sound, a sound panel. So I'm kind of trying to tie back that, but that through this breaching exercise, I'll let everyone keep reading it. Kind of exposing some of these latent, orientations that people have to the device, and based on kind of a lot of the same social dimensions, and around race and gender and ability. Not race as much in my sample. I'm sure if I expanded the sample, which I want to do, I would see that. But certainly, what I'm seeing is gender and status, or gender and ability. That people are really, in very concrete ways, relating kind of this mapping of really things that we see play out day to day in human interactions, and kind of at a societal level. So it kind of became a lever. You can see over here on the right. That it's not such a surprise, right? That people feel this way, and that people are characterizing the devices in this way, and and developing expectations and assumptions of these devices in this way from gender and ability, which I don't have as much in the data here, but didn't have the time. But like here's Google's, most recent came out like a month ago, advertising campaign, Make Google Do It. So it has a female voice, and it's in your home, and it doesn't have a female name, but you're interacting with it. One of the men I interviewed named Pierce, he said it about the device. He objectified it every single time until the device kind of jumped into the conversation, said something, and then the next sentence he said she or her. Because, right after you hear it, it's priming you to think, with this kind of social cue. And it's a really micro level analysis, but really, it's playing out. And so this kind of emerging status relation develop, it's not a surprise. And yeah, to add a quick note, companies, if you'll see every single one of their websites is, it refers to these devices with a neuter pronoun, third person pronoun, it's it, or it's the name Alexa or Google Assistant. And then no one else does. All of the owners, all of the producers saying she, and this is what's, getting built into interactions. Sum up to try to tie it up, a little bit more concretely to what we're talking about today. The voice interface is a really powerful tool, and it's not only reflecting and mirroring kind of, the social issues that we're experiencing day to day, but also in some respects reproducing them in a new way with these devices. And so here's a quote from that guy Pierce: "I like the female voice better in general. I don't know why. It's just, I feel like all the movies, how I imagine AI's voice, I don't have a good reason for it." So, this is a young white man, right, who wants a female voice. These are the people that end up buying these. These are kind of what's feeding into the data these companies are using to design these. Not to say it's all the companies, it's all on the companies, but just to say that these kind of, these kind of dynamics end up getting fed in. There's a really strong feedback loop, literally reproducing kind of how we're interacting with these devices and the social norms that are and will be. So thank you so much, everyone. I think I'm at time. And yeah.
Cafeteria voice.
Actually?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Rob is a writer and editor living between Brooklyn and Durham, North Carolina. Within the arts, his work deals with immaterial labor, platform precarity, and the many ongoing frictions between digital platforms and the cultural production they now sustain, both online and off. He's written for Spin, Pitchfork, Noisy, The Outline, and Real Life, and is currently a graduate student at Duke University. He's excited to combine many parts of his life into a talk on algorithms, data, and aesthetics. Please welcome Rob.
Should I just kind of speak loudly too, I guess?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm Rob Arcand. I'm a journalist. I'm finishing my master's at Duke, and I work at Spin magazine doing the news on the weekends. And my work really focuses on the relationship between digital platforms and cultural production. And there we go. I was just my work is on the relationship between digital platforms and cultural production, and how our understanding of culture might be changing in the hands of monopolistic platforms and their practices. So today, I really want to talk about data, specifically the ways in which data has become a new vehicle for the expansion of capitalism, fueling a variety of platforms who've built entire business models around finding new ways to extract more and more value from cultural spaces. Most recently, if we think of something like Facebook, especially Cambridge Analytica and all that, it's pretty clear that algorithms and the data that animate them is opening up new spheres of power and influence that beyond being very valuable in the advertising world, fundamentally change our relationship to things like music and culture and culture more broadly. While they largely come from quantifiable positivistic origins in computer science, engineering, and the runaway financial world, frequently tied to the tech world, algorithms are deeply cultural objects. Following the work of folks like Ed Finn and Terrell Gillespie at Cornell, I want to argue that the interface layer of platforms across the board has socio-political valence through aesthetics of inclusion and exclusion, using now fairly common data valence practices to monitor and quantify lived experience through tools on the platform. For folks like Ed Finn or Nick Seaver, algorithms represent a pretty broad category of computational processes, and it seems pretty important to specify exactly what we're talking about in this space. In his book, What Algorithms Want, Finn draws a distinction between a pragmatic and cultural definition of the algorithm, as both aspects increasingly weave their way into everyday life. Drawing on the work of Catherine Hales at Duke, Finn notes that the pragmatist definition grounds its truth claim in utility. Algorithms are fit for a purpose, illuminating pathways between problems and solutions related to what Hales calls a hard claim for computationalism. Building on Hales's writing, Finn suggests that there's a guiding logic behind the thought that all human processes can be reduced to quantification and effectively streamlined by algorithmic means. Yet as algorithms move deeper and deeper into cultural space, as many already realize, a whole spectrum for social and anthropological observation opens up in this gap between cultural and technical definitions. Again, it seems like a simple observation, but the interface layer you interact with on your computer, on your mobile phone, etc., that represents the culmination of everything, collecting data under an illusion of platform utility, but also masking the labor of designers, of content moderators, of advertising experts, etc., under the guise of a seamless user experience, and pretty frequently at the direct expense of privacy. This abstraction of labor feels intensified in cultural spaces specifically through the introduction of recommendation engines, which use algorithms grounded in this accumulation of data to produce an ever-changing network of taste profiles, fundamentally changing our relationship to things like taste, criticism, culture, and others, all while masking the influence of cultural actors in this algorithmic space. So to tie it back to music specifically, which is my focus as a journalist and as a grad student, I think it's helpful to give a bit of a historical overview on one company that's been incredibly successful using data to reshape the foundation of music culture, and that's Spotify. So back in 2006, Spotify grew out of a new entanglement between business and the totalizing digital archive. As many probably already know, the early 2000s saw companies like Napster, LimeWire, Pirate Bay, and others building new widely popular tools that enabled widespread music piracy, practically upheaving the record industry and its model for music as a saleable digital commodity. While iTunes and others were able to negotiate, pretty unprecedented deals at the time with record labels. The record industry, of course, still saw a huge decline in revenue. And as an outsider, Spotify grew out of this specific moment of opportunism, seeking to translate the seamless experience of unlimited access through piracy to a new low-cost subscription-based and ad-supported model. Untethering digital audio from the MP3 ownership model of the digital marketplace, Spotify instead established a new model built around the playlist as a finite cultural object. And branded playlists, of course, have been central to the company's founding and really took off in the 2010s with well-known playlists like Rap Caviar, Undercurrents, Discover Weekly, and others, of course, becoming central to their image as a finely tuned playlist machine. But none of this would really be possible without help from a little data science team known as the Echo Nest. So in its early days, Spotify acquired data from a company called the Echo Nest that was founded in 2005 by a few PhD students at the MIT Media Lab. The Echo Nest sought to automate musical classification through two primary methods, those of computer audition or machine listening classification, which captured the sonic, acoustic qualities of things like timbre, structure, duration, pitch, etc., embedded within like the MP3 as a finite cultural product, and those of cultural context on music sites, on blogs, and other means of like cultural conversation online. So in contrast, to something like Pandora, whose music genome project has long since stressed the humanistic side of classification. For a while, they hired PhD musicology students, and they were sort of tasked with determining the sort of musicological classifications of things like the gender of the lead vocalist, the tempo of the chorus, the level of distortion on guitars, and sort of reducing that to a 36-page system of classification. The Echo Nest instead attempted to automate this process, building highly semantic profiles of audio culture based entirely around collected data. As Robert Prey writes in his essay, Nothing Personal, Algorithmic Individuation on Streaming Platforms, to this end, the Echo Nest developed a preference analytic and visualization tool called the taste profile. Every interaction a listener has with a musical item, including things like listeners' taste, artists, songs, favorites, ratings, skips, bands, etc., is captured and recorded in real time. So to kind of give you a glimpse of just a small portion of the data that they collect, I went on the Spotify web API and just scraped a slight amount for the song Hey Jude by the Beatles. This is sort of what they call the upper level audio analysis, which is things like key, tempo, loudness, energy, danceability, acousticness. These features are unique to the Spotify platform and are quantified on a scale between 0 and 1. And then this is like time-based analysis, so you have, it attempts to like map things in terms of like what we would traditionally associate with meter, bars, and measures, and in kind of these musicological terms, but often it's pretty inaccurate and a bad metric for these things. But so where before, big data, these quantifications like danceability, acousticness, liveness, and others maybe once represented one's subjective interpretation of a song, whether you think it's very danceable or whatever. Their place on Spotify is yet another attempt to quantify taste, extracting latent value from the MP3, once limited to the realm of aesthetic interpretation, into the platform by design. And it also feels worth mentioning specifically that this is built on the back of an advertising engine. Spotify has, of course, since its early days, pursued sponsored playlists with a variety of companies in the interest of creating experiences. In 2016, Spotify's global creative director, Rick Frankel, points to the ongoing collaborations with brands like Nike, Starbucks, BMW, and others as ways of moving forward. And just what does it mean to have something as disparate as taste reduced to quantification and danceability in the service of a liquor brand or a beer company or something. So it's hard to talk about value without talking about the labor and workers behind it, and it's in this sense that I want to argue that the biggest challenge for this algorithmic layer of streaming platforms, not just Spotify but others, Apple Music, SoundCloud, Tidal, YouTube, and in some cases Netflix might apply, is to find new ways to extract more and more surplus value from new efficiencies present through music as a commodity. Drawing on the work of folks like Christian Fuchs, Catherine Hales, Michael Hart, and others, I see Spotify as a kind of cybernetic system designed to maximize the extraction of value, not only from the MP3 as a commodity, but also from this the vast amount of workers and creators behind its cultural context. As a journalist, our work every day is powering the kind of Spotify engine to produce the cultural context for music in their system, and musicians especially are losing a lot of, are just pouring labor and time and work into creating this kind of algorithmic system. So it seems commonly understood that Spotify wants to keep listeners within this ecosystem. At points even going so far as to produce what they call algatorial content to resituate music into a contextual system of their own design, provided through a combination of algorithmic curation and what they're now doing with short-form editorial content, which the name algatorial kind of implies. This move especially aligns with the guiding logic of cybernetic capitalism, which, as the French writers collective Tikkun defined it in their cybernetic hypothesis, is an autonomous world of apparatuses so blended with the capitalist project that has become a political project. Elsewhere in the text, they write, the cybernetic gesture affirms itself in the negation of everything that escapes regulation. For a lot of people critiquing neoliberalism and late capitalism, the neoliberal project was an attempt to extend privatization into public spaces, or the commons once reserved for collective municipal use. If we read music piracy as a kind of universal access at one point, free from centralized ownership and intellectual property litigation, we can interpret the ad-supported subscription-based models of Spotify and others as cybernetic extensions into the realm of cultural production. But to return to Tikkun, the original rise of cybernetics in the wake of World War II mirrors the rise of neoliberal capitalism, instituting various methods to control the production of social groups for its own corporate use in industrial management. They write, after 1945, cybernetics supplied capitalism with a new infrastructure of machines, computers, and above all, with the intellectual technology that permitted the regulation of the circulation of flows within society, making those flows exclusively commodity flows. So if we think of the way commodities flow online and the way we are attempting to quantify everything with data, this mirrors the development of neoliberalism historically. And so more to my point with streaming, I want to argue that at every point in the Spotify ecosystem, each layer necessary in the production of culture is now reduced to a cog in a system of cybernetic social control. What once represented a diverse variety of scenes, subcultures, and communities online has now, through the reduction of music to data and further integration of these practices, reduced music culture and the image of cybernetic capitalize to maximize profit for Spotify and for their shareholders now that they've gone public. So even more broadly than Spotify itself, much of what's been made of new platform services in the gig economy more broadly is the ways in which they've used the convenience of mobile applications to tap into the latent value of ownership. To return to Ed Finn's What Algorithms Want, he writes, in terms of labor and surplus value, what the algorithms of Uber, Airbnb, and their cohorts capitalize on is the slack infrastructure of modern consumption. Empty cars, unused homes, and underemployed people. Viewed more broadly, the interface layer is a colonization of the quiet backwaters of contemporary capitalism, the remobilization of goods and spaces after they have already been consumed or deployed. So I think it makes sense to extend this critique to the cognitive labor of content creation of all types. You know, whatever your status is on Spotify, SoundCloud, and other platforms, I think at each level, cultural workers are not only asked to break even financially themselves, but also forced into this weird, messy, ever-changing agreement with the platform to provide surplus value in exchange for just a simple place on the platform. So not only is this about surplus value, but it's also about rent in this kind of capitalist sense. In his essay on Google's PageRank algorithm, Matteo Pasquinelli suggests the notion of the extraction of rent to be a more efficient model for discussing the relations between platforms and content creators, rather than surplus value alone. For creative industries especially, platform monopolies extract a cognitive rent as media corporations simply exploit the copyright of artworks that have virtually no cost in the reproduction. In his reading, rent is a parasitic income, and owners can, just by possessing an asset, earn money. And Google specifically, which is his focus, Google appears as pure rent on the meta dimension of information that is an accumulation through the digital network. So all of this is really to say that the data and the extraction of new value from works of art open up new spheres of power and influence that have huge implications for the music industry and culture more broadly. Already we've seen, supposed to be another slide there. Already we've seen third-party playlist creators on places like Spotify trying to game the system and working out deals with record labels, places like companies like Filter, which is now owned by Sony, Digster, which is now owned by Warner, and Topsify, which is now owned by Universal. These are a way for firms to funnel resources normally gambled on branding, publicity, and others in the music industry toward more promising playlists in the Spotify ecosystem. But at the same time, this algorithmic layer hasn't been completely conquered, and I still think there's a few people working in this space who are particularly attuned to the politics of platforms. To return to the cybernetic hypothesis, Tikkun suggests that there's a potential to disrupt the cybernetic system, which I think in a lot of readings for people working with machine vision, they talk a lot about using I'm running out of time, but all this is to say that platforms are changing our relationship to music culture going forward, and this is a lot of my work going forward at Duke, but thank you.
Thank you so much, and we'll have time for questions if you want. If there's anything to clarify, please feel free to ask Rob. Lastly, we have Jack Webster. He'll be talking about taste in the digital age, how are music streaming services shaping the relationship between taste, consumption, and class identity. Jack is a final year PhD student at the Web Science Center for Doctoral Training at the University of Southampton. Jack's research deals with issues relating to how digital platforms are shaping the production and consumption of culture. He also has experience working in the recorded music industry, conducting research on behalf of major record labels. Please welcome Jack.
Okay, hello, thanks for having me. Rob's presentations hopefully set mine up quite nicely, talking about streaming and collection of data and what this is doing to how we consume music. So that's really nice. I'll get stuck into what I have to say. So music streaming services such as Spotify and Apple Music are transforming the way many of us access and consume music. Not only do these platforms facilitate access to vast catalogues of licensed music at little or no cost, but increasingly they are curating our encounters with it. These firms are gathering large volumes of very granular data about who we are and what we like to listen to, and combining this information with the latest advancements in machine learning technologies in order to shape what and how music is made available to us through the creation of playlists, recommendations, and other forms of curated content. These transformations invite us to consider if and how using music streaming services is disrupting the social dynamics of consumption. So let's do a quick survey. How many of you in the room use a music streaming service such as Spotify, Apple Music? Okay, so that's almost everybody. How many of you engage with the curated content they produce, so say Spotify's playlists or recommendations? Okay, fewer. And how many of you feel like using these services has shaped your relationship with music in some way? Okay, it's quite a few of you. So it'll be interesting to reflect on how your experiences relate to the kind of things I'm going to speak about today. So in the 1960s, the influential sociologist Pierre Bourdieu demonstrated to us how cultural taste and consumption are implicated in the reproduction of class divisions. So Bourdieu would argue that what and how I consume music reveals to you information about my class background and distinguishes me as a member of the middle classes. In doing so, my taste distances me from members of the working or upper classes. Over time, sociologists have developed our understanding of the changing relationship between taste, consumption, and class. For example, the mass production of culture occurring in the latter half of the 20th century has transformed the accessibility of culture, and the concept of the omnivore was introduced to acknowledge how class taste has incorporated cultural abundance. More recently, social sciences have speculated about if and how streaming services have the potential to disrupt the relationship between taste, consumption, and class. For example, David Beer argues that in a context where culture now finds us, the cultivation of taste has the potential to become divorced from traditional socialization processes. Whilst David Wright argues that the use of recommendation technologies has the potential to reinforce divisions in class taste. However, little empirical consideration has been given to the question of if and how using streaming services is shaping the relationship between taste, consumption, and class. So in response to this, I present findings from a qualitative study about how using Spotify is shaping how class divisions are reproduced through the consumption of music. In particular, today I'm going to argue that the ways in which Spotify mediates access to music is undermining the potential for musical expertise to function as cultural capital. So let's unpack this statement a bit more. So firstly, when I talk about mediation, I'm referring to how music streaming services make music available, from how they present music to us when we log onto their apps, to the playlists and recommendations they create using data about who we are and what we like to listen to. And secondly, let's discuss this concept of cultural capital and how it relates to class reproduction. In order to do this, I need to briefly discuss my approach to class analysis and the theoretical and conceptual framework I used. So I adopt what sociologists call a culturalist approach to class analysis. So rather than exclusively relying on economic indicators as markers of class background and class divisions, this approach sees culture, lifestyle, and taste to be integral to how class organizes social life. This approach sees class identity manifesting implicit, individual, and routine ways through practices such as music consumption. Like many culturalist approaches, I draw on Pierre Bourdieu's conceptual and theoretical framework. So Bourdieu uses the concept of habitus to explain how class background shapes our cultural practices. You can think of habitus as the lens or framework through which we see and act in the world, and Bourdieu uses this this concept and argues that this lens is a product of our class upbringing. So this framework is built from the ideas, experiences, and values we are exposed to growing up as members of the working, middle, or upper classes. According to Bourdieu, our position in class society, so i.e. whether we're working, middle, or upper class, is an outcome of the volume and composition of economic, social, and cultural capital we have access to. So economic capital refers to financial assets, social capital refers to personal networks and connections, and cultural capital refers to resources such as education, language, and good taste. Crucially, for something to function as capital, it must be convertible into some kind of social advantage. For example, education helping you get a good job. In Bourdieu's terminology, the dominant classes, think middle or upper class, are those with high levels of economic, cultural, and/or social capital. So to return to my main point, I argue that using Spotify is undermining the potential for musical expertise to function as cultural capital for the dominant classes. I argue that this is because the ways in which the platform is mediating access to music, meaning how it makes music available, is closing down opportunities for individuals to display their taste and familiarity with music, by implication, limiting the opportunities to convert this expertise into social advantage, thereby limiting its potential to function as capital. So the findings I'm presenting you today are based on 20 semi-strict interviews I conducted with individuals from different class backgrounds. My data collection analysis used a narrative approach, which aimed to explore the development of my participants' biographies over time and how using streaming has shaped their relationship with music. My data collection focused specifically on the use of Spotify, the leading service in the UK. The data collection was conducted as part of a larger study involving interviews with both industry key informants and users of Spotify. So alongside the study of consumption, my research has explored in greater detail what, why, and how Spotify mediates access to music, highlighting the importance of new forms of data-driven mediation, the kind of things Rob's been talking about. So today I'm going to focus on consumption practices, but feel free to ask me more about the other aspects of my research at the end of this presentation. I'm going to limit myself to 2 contrasting vignettes about how using Spotify is shaping how 2 individuals, Jamie and Sean, perform class identity through the consumption of music. So let's begin with the story of Jamie. Jamie is in his early 20s and works in social media and marketing. Jamie was born in the UK, but has lived in a number of countries around the world because of his father's high-ranking occupation in the oil industry. And he studied philosophy at university in the UK. So Jamie's habitus, i.e. the lens through which he interacts with music, is characterised by an intellectualised engagement with music and an appreciation for music as an end in of itself. For example, creating playlists on Spotify is a way for him to demonstrate his taste and affirm his status as a music expert, as his comments illustrate. Jamie's habitus is a product of his upbringing in a cultural capital-rich middle-class family, where emphasis was placed on the value of cultural familiarity and competence. For example, Jamie and his father share an appreciation for music as an end in of itself. They often debate about what counts as good taste, and they both agree that music should possess artistic merit, which they describe as music which explores new ideas and has creative purpose. The way in which Spotify mediates access to music comes into contention with Jamie's habitus. Jamie harbours some resentment towards Spotify because of the way in which the service undermines the consumption of music as an end in of itself. Jamie feels that the continuous servicing of music through features such as Discover Weekly, a playlist of new music which refreshes on a weekly basis, undermines the value of music because he is spending less time appreciating what is made available to him by Spotify, which is in contention with his habitus. Moreover, Spotify is resented by Jamie because it undermines the musical expertise he possesses. Jamie describes the act of discovery as being consigned to the scrap heap because it is now automated by Spotify's recommendation systems. Whilst this is advantageous because the rate and scale at which Jamie can discover has increased, it also generates concern that he's being musically pigeonholed rather than broadening his horizons, which is a defining part of how he relates to music, as he explains. So Jamie's story highlights one way in which using Spotify is shaping how class identity is performed through the consumption of music. In this case, the way in which Spotify mediates access to music is limiting the opportunities for Jamie to appreciate music as an end in of itself and exercise his musical expertise, thereby undermining the potential for Jamie to reap the rewards from the cultural capital he has access to, thanks to his upbringing in a middle-class family. So the second narrative I'd like to discuss is the story of Sean, one of my working-class participants. Sean is in her early 20s and works as a receptionist. She left school at 16 and went straight into the workforce. In contrast to Jamie, Sean's habitus is characterised by an appreciation for music as a means to an end. Music is appreciated on the basis of how well it services particular situations, activities, and moods, as Sean explains. These differences in habitus can be seen as a product of the different conditions of existence in which Sian and Jamie's habituses were cultivated. Sian grew up in a working class household where her mother was a cleaner and her father was a kitchen porter. Whilst music was also omnipresent in the home, consumption was about emotional and sentimental value, unlike Jamie's family who used it as an opportunity to exercise their familiarity with the signs and symbols of good taste. Again, in contrast to Jamie, Sian is not resentful about the way in which music is mediated to her by Spotify. Sian embraces the promise of streaming and is celebratory about the way the platforms is able to service situations with music and help her to discover more of what she likes and is familiar with. However, this does not mean that Sian is a cultural dupe. There is still an expectation that the content being served to her is compatible with her habitus and by extension her class background. Sian does not take Spotify's curated content at face value. Rather, she critically engages with it to determine whether the content is right for her before choosing something to listen to, as she explains. So Sian's story offers a contrasting account of how using Spotify is shaping the performance of class identity. The way in which Spotify mediates access to music does not come into conflict with Sian's habitus in the same way that it does for Jamie. As music consumption is less of an intellectual exercise, the stakes are different for Sian, and she appreciates Spotify's ability to matchmake music with the activities, situations, and moods in which she consumes music. So in summary, the stories of Jamie and Sian demonstrate to us some of the ways using Spotify is shaping the social dynamics of consumption. Jamie's narrative highlighted to us how the way in which Spotify mediates access to music is closing down opportunities to deploy and convert cultural capital, whereas for Sian the stakes are different because the consumption of music is not implicated in deployment and accumulation of cultural capital in the same way. These findings are significant because they highlight to us how Spotify is challenging existing accounts about how music taste and consumption are implicated in the reproduction of class divisions. From a culturalist and Bordeauxian perspective on class, the accumulation and deployment of cultural capital is fundamental to how class divisions are reproduced, as it is a means through which the dominant classes can maintain their dominance through access to assets such as education, cultural competence, and legitimate taste. However, the ways in which music streaming services mediate access to music invite us to consider our understanding of how cultural capital is accumulated and deployed in the digital age. This is not to suggest that class no longer matters. Rather, we need to continue to examine how processes of class reproduction are adapting to the changing ways cultural goods are made available to us by platforms such as music streaming services. Thank you.
Great.
Okay, so we've got like 5 minutes or so for questions. Would anyone like to start us off? You.
Yeah, for those you Spotify boys. Do you guys pay attention to Neeland, or do you know about Neeland, the algorithm? Yeah, I'm curious about how you see them. They like created Discover Weekly algorithm, right, and the Daily Mixes algorithm, supposedly. How do you see what they want? What do they as a company want, and what do those algorithms want?
Yeah, I think maybe the biggest challenge for Spotify is to mediate what they want and mediate what users want and mediate what musicians want, and they're kind of playing this cat and mouse game trying to make everyone happy, but I'm not sure. I think that's something they're figuring out, especially as they go public, but I don't know, honestly.
What does the Daily Mix algorithm want, or what does Discover Weekly want out of us as consumers?
It just wants us to spend as much time on our Discover Weekly playlist as possible, I think.
Okay.
But.
Margot, what were some of the things you learned from the elderly people using Alexa? I know my grandmother can't really see an iPad or an iPhone, like her eyesight's not good enough, so she loves the voice interface. What kind of things did you find?
Sure. What things that I learned by interviewing the individuals who lived in the elderly retirement home. The first thing I'd say is I was a little bit surprised by how like tech savvy they were, and how like there was so many how these people used the device in the same way, right? Or would interact in the same way, or had the same kind of like something I'm looking at is like how transparent or opaque is the back end to owners. And so like, you know, this 95-year-old woman sometimes like, oh yeah, the engineers are programming it to do this, or like some script writer, you know, and at Amazon just makes these bad jokes. They're like super aware, right? But also I think it's a really self-selected group of people that chose to speak with me. So there was that kind of bias playing in. Something that was really interesting, so I like learning those kind of things was, right, was that it wasn't as much of a comparative study as I thought it was going to be. But was kind of the unique use cases, like you're saying. So one of the women had low vision. So I think like a lot of these people. I also work with someone at Cornell Tech who looks at like who also has low vision, and so we're kind of looking at how these devices can be used for these different communities. And there was someone at the retirement home who had low vision and couldn't hear that well, but had the device read the Bible to her every day, and with the Alexa voice, not with some other app thing, but also kept on arguing about whether or not it was a female or male voice. So really, it was hard of hearing, but was still really was still really interested and committed to using the device. So just kind of to some extent, the level really of just having the device present or around, the level of not true companionship these people got, but just kind of like saying good morning, having routines based around it being there was more prevalent with those interviews. Again, 4, so sample size n equals 4, so small, but compared to kind of the younger 20s and 30-year-old people that I spoke with.
Alexa would kind of interrupt in your interviews when it had its own name. It was really fascinating. I wondered if you had any findings specifically around how people talk about the devices rather than necessarily to them, because this kind of way in which they interrupt conversations about themselves kind of disrupts your ability to criticize them. I guess is there anything you found out there?
Totally. So I haven't focused on that, but there is a ton of data about it. So like the way these symbolic interactionists or microsociologists talk about it is like barging in. So, you know, that really interrupts. And people did talk about the ways that they, when they're in group settings, will you know, kind of like whisper or like search, just like, you know, like we're talking about, like I'm talking about Amazon, and like I'll say it quietly so I don't say the name or something, so it pops in. So that stuff, again, like all this stuff's on a spectrum of kind of how hyper aware people are of the device. So here it's like, I don't want Amazon, like surveillance is so far on the other side of the spectrum. I almost put a pin in it for this study, right? Because people are super aware of not wanting some stuff being heard. But something that was interesting there for interrupting is, I don't think right now we're at a place like from a technical perspective, but there's a huge question of whether or not we should be able to interrupt the device, or the device should be able to interrupt us, right? Tying in this whole question of gender and assertiveness, along with personality, not only what it says and how it says it, right, the cadence at which it says things, but also kind of like with turn taking and stuff. That's also another way of there. You know, there's gender and power dynamics and kind of how we even just have conversations. And so barging in is something that I might go back when I'm finished with kind of this research and kind of dig into. I'm sure there's way more interesting stuff in there than even just this. Yeah.
Quick question for Jack. Do people like Jamie who are grumpy at music streaming services, do they buy vinyl basically? Like, is that how they prove that they're cool, given that music service can't do that for them?
Yeah, so there's more to Jamie and that, and you kind of touched on it there. So in the kind of other parts of my thesis, I talk about how using music streaming is also encouraging other ways of consuming music as a response to the immateriality and ephemerality of consuming music on Spotify. So that resentment that Jamie has about the speed and rate at which music is made available to him, in contrast, consuming music on vinyl is kind of like the slow consumption of music. It's slower, it's more deliberate, you create time and space. So for him, whom music is a big part of his identity and is kind of how he articulates his cultural capital, vinyl consumption is a thing for him, but not necessarily for everybody. But that definitely came out as a kind of a way of resisting how Spotify makes music available. You can slow it down, it's more material, that kind of thing.
All right, will you all stick around? here